Greg, take all the time you need to cover this very important topic on the future of intelligence. So over to you, Greg.
Great. Thanks very much, AJ. It's great to be here and great to be with everybody. I had a wonderful opportunity recently to be on a panel on the future of intelligence in London with two old friends and former comrades at arms, John Scarlett, who used to run MI6, and David Omand, who ran GCHQ, the British NSA. It was a great chance to reflect on intelligence, and I thought I would take those reflections and share them with you, really along 8 dimensions. The first dimension for me is the big one, and that is we've moved to a world of limited small amounts of information, too many secrets, to a world of ubiquitous information. That seems to me to be a very big transition. We used to prize collection in intelligence. Now with ubiquitous information, it's more processing, trying to make sense of the data that's out there. And it also makes, I think we've tended to think of an intelligence cycle where we start with requirements, then we collect against the requirements, then we process, then we analyze, and then we disseminate. Well, that was always a bit of a fiction, but it seems to me it's less and less applicable today. It might have made sense in the Cold War when we were focused on one overwhelming target, the Soviet Union. It can't make much sense today. John Scarlett asked in our reflections in London whether this world of ubiquitous information made espionage, traditional espionage, less important. I think his answer would be no. I'm a little less certain about my answer in this world of ubiquitous information. We often think that spying is a way to get inside the heads of the adversary, and sometimes it can be, but it's also a target of opportunity enterprise, that sometimes your spy will not be in the meeting or won't be able to communicate. Indeed, I once did a rogues gallery of those Americans that had spied for foreign countries on the United States. And what struck me was almost all of them were engaged in places where they knew something about either technology or about our own espionage agents. They weren't those that might have known about what was going on inside the heads of political leaders. I've gotten in this world of ubiquitous information more attracted by something called activity-based intelligence. I won't try and give you a primer on that, but basically the idea was to geolocate everything we know about a particular place. It was very useful in Afghanistan and Iraq. So it would happen, a drone would see a pickup truck pull up to a ranch or farm. It would then search the database to see if that was an event of interest. If it was, they'd go forward. If it wasn't, then it would just be stored because it might be of interest later. So activity-based intelligence was what really got us onto Osama bin Laden's driver. It was very helpful in doing patterns of life that would sort out which were pious Muslims going to mosque and which were would-be terrorists planning something. I like the technique, but I also like the spirit of it as much as anything else. It's sequence neutral. It says we may know the answer before we know the question. I'm particularly attracted to that because you think, how often in life is that true, that basically you don't know you were puzzled about something until you learn the answer? It's also information neutral. It says information is good when it's good, not good if it's not good, doesn't prize intelligence as particular sources. And third, it is more about correlation than causation. Perhaps this is an artifact of getting older, but I find that I'm less impressed by causation in human affairs than I used to be, and therefore correlation is attractive to me. Second dimension is, for me, is rebalancing strategic and tactical. The United States fought wars for more than 20 years, and in the process, its intelligence got very tactical. I used to, when I was chairing the NIC, I would notice when we did something about Nigeria, there wasn't much Nigeria there. It was mostly Boko Haram, the terrorist group. And when we did Boko Haram, there wasn't a lot of Boko Haram there either. Sure, we were interested in where these people came from and where they might be going, but the overwhelming need was to unravel the networks and be able to target them. I've come to think of intelligence as really storytelling and story adjusting. And it seems to me in this world, I agree with President Biden, we're at some inflection point, but a lingering inflection point. It seems to me that makes some strategic view all the more important, trying to make some sense of a world that is really quite different and moving in ways that we don't always appreciate. In storytelling, my favorite example is from a kindred discipline to intelligence. That's medicine. Maybe you won't think of it as too kindred, but there was a story about Ebola, which was good until it wasn't. The story was that Ebola was so lethal, it would kill people before they had a chance to transmit the disease to other people. That was right, but then it stopped being right as rural-urban communications in Africa got better. So similarly, I think most of what we think of as intelligence failures are those where people cling to a story too long. Think about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. All of us, including people like me that opposed the war, thought that Saddam Hussein, yes, had weapons of mass destruction. So our challenge now, it seems to me, is to create and adjust stories for a very uncertain, fast-moving world. There, I think China is the strongest case in point. We've tended, I think, to substitute labels like new Cold War for serious analysis of the strategic implications of what's going on, both bad and good, in China. And that's the challenge, I think, as we go forward. Third dimension is AI. AI is going to be a great boon, I think, to intelligence. It's one way to make sense of all that information that's out there. Don Rumsfeld famously talked about his three categories, which were known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. I've filled out that matrix with the fourth category, which is known unknowns. That is the things unknown knowns. That is things we know, but don't remember we know or didn't know we know. Best example is probably those Arabs who were going to flight schools in the several years before 9/11. So I think one of the things that AI and machines will do is really help analysts remember things, create hypotheses. It'll be a great boon. Obviously, it comes with some cautions. Tesla is my favorite caution. We've been talking about self-driving cars since the 1990s, and we still don't have one that actually works reliably. So the challenge, I think, for intelligence will be for analysts to understand the algorithms in artificial intelligence well enough to trust them and well enough to explain them to policymakers who are not going to obviously be great at the technology. Fourth dimension is really not ubiquitous information, but ubiquitous surveillance, cameras, facial recognition. I sometimes think when we think about the tradecraft of espionage, we're like those old Roadrunner cartoons where the Roadrunner ran off the cliff but didn't start to fall until he looked down. Well, I think we haven't quite looked down yet. I was struck before I went into the government, one of my colleagues at RAND had been a station chief for the CIA. And after he retired, the agency asked him to do an errand or task for them in that particular country. And he said he would, but only under true name. Wasn't going to try and go as an alias because he knew he'd be found and never get back into that country. Already, it seems to me, with the war on terror, we were very much more dependent on liaison. We were, after 9/11, by one count, sharing information with 27 countries, including longtime friends like Russia and Iran. So I think the future is very much about liaison. Fifth dimension is really the use of intelligence, not just for policy, but tactically. And here the war in Ukraine has been obviously a pretty strong breakpoint. We've seen intelligence used more publicly than any other time I remember. And most of the intelligence that's been shared has been imagery. And that's relatively easy because now you can buy or get for free on Google lots of imagery. But we've also shared other things about Russian plans, Russian intentions. We've always been one step ahead of Putin saying, we know you're going to do this, we think you're going to do that. That's been, to me a quite striking example, and it does suggest at least that we probably have some human or electronic source that is relatively close to Putin. So there is, as we move forward in this world, there will be some cost to sources and methods, which is the traditional holy grail of intelligence. But I think we are moving into a world when intelligence is much more likely to be used, not just for strategic and policymaking purposes, but for tactical and public persuasion purposes. Next dimension for me is a big one. It means asking, well, in this world of ubiquitous information, what is the purpose of government intelligence agencies? Take imagery, for example. That means that imagery, classic products of NGA, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, only get 3 acronyms in Washington, 3 letters in your acronym. Most of its products you can now, as I said, get online or from Google. And so it raises the question, how does a government intelligence service add value? When I look out at the firms like Bellingcat that are doing really interesting open source, OSINT in the jargon of the trade, open source investigations of things like the Russian intelligence service, the FSB, it's really pretty impressive what's out there. And it does raise the question, how does the government national intelligence services add value? When I was chairing the NIC, at one point I thought I didn't have enough contact with the deputy secretaries, the number 2s in the foreign affairs agencies. So I thought I would have a weekly newsletter, sort of a view from the NIC, from the chair. And I thought if I tried to curate materials we'd already done, I'd be more likely to confuse policy people than to help them. So then I thought, well, maybe I should just step back and say, okay, what does the world look like from where I sit, thinking about intelligence 24/7? But I realized I probably couldn't do any better than Ian Bremmer, the head of the Eurasia Group. I had the advantage of some secrets, but he has the great advantage of talking to all these people, going and traveling around the world, talking to leaders. So it does raise the question for me of what does government intelligence add? Interesting sidelight is the CIA has finally started crowdsourcing. It's been on Telegram, inviting Russians to come and help us and providing secret ways for them to make contact with the agency. They've had something like 2.5 million hits. So it's come away, intelligence agencies have come a long way. When I did a study of use of social media by intelligence agencies 15 years ago, I came across a wonderful Intellipedia. It was basically a classified Wikipedia for intelligence. The young CIA analysts who were doing it referred to themselves on their business cards as Intellipedia evangelists, which always made me hope they didn't have befall the same fate as the original evangelists. But one of them charmingly said to me, he said, we should be out on Facebook and Twitter as the CIA. He said, we'd get lots of disinformation, but we get that anyway. And what charming was, he said, and there might be people out there who'd like to help us. A great thought. David Oman, whom we were meeting in London, his thought is that we need to think about the social compact around intelligence, and that requires thinking about sort of a triangle. His triangle is what's supplied, what's wanted by policy people, and then how do you think of the other dimension, which is ethics and law. And it seems to me the Brits have done better than we have at thinking about what is the social compact. Obviously, the war on terrorism, we needed to collect a lot more information on our citizens and inhabitants, did change the nature of the social compact. And I rather wish we'd done it a little bit more self-aware way. My seventh dimension is really the need for intelligence to pretty dramatically change the way it thinks of personnel practices and maybe even some security practices. Now the model is you join in your 20s, stay for a long career, then retire, often come back making more money with a contractor doing about the same thing you did before. I think that that's not a career pattern that young people these days are going to want to do. They're going to want to go in and out. They're going to want to have several different careers. particularly if intelligence is going to get access to the technical people it needs. It's not going to get many of those for an entire career, not on government salaries, but it might get them for periods when they want to come and maybe give something back, see how the other side lives. When I was vice chair of the NIC, I was trying to hire distinguished outsiders to be national intelligence officers. I did find that I could get people kind of near the end of their careers when they had no more worlds to conquer in academia or the think tank world, and they would be attracted by the idea of seeing how the other half lives, but also by the opportunity to give something back to their country. Somehow we've got to structure ways to let that happen. We also got to think about the way the demands people make on intelligence people. After all, what other line of business do you have to leave your cell phone in your car all day? Gen Zers, I think, are not likely to stand for that. And so we need to think about that and the polygraph and other things that may infringe quite a lot on people's personal lives. One of my great colleagues, Carmen Medina, a CIA analyst, the way she put it, she said, you know, I'd like to live like this. The CIA wants me to live like this, she'd say, and I'm 60 years old. Imagine what a Gen Zer is going to feel and how they're going to feel. So it does seem we need to think through how intelligence hires, how it lets people move back and forth, and how it treats the people who work for it. Those things that seem to have got to change. My final dimension is one I wish I had more to say about. I wish I had more ideas about, and that is the world we live in, which seems to be one in which truth is more and more personal, more and more subjective. Indeed, in some respects, the whole idea that statements can be validated or invalidated empirically seems to be under attack. And how intelligence responds in that world, I can't think of anything better than sort of to double down, to basically say, we're in the business of trying to tell the truth. That's what we do. It will make, I think, the validation function all the more important. When I would testify on the Hill, congressmen were always interested in saying, why do we have so many analysts? Can't we cut the analysts? And I would always say, first, analysts are cheap. And second, in a world of exploding information where the internet is a stew of fact and fiction and disinformation, we need more and more people to help policy people and others separate what's true from what's not true. Long years ago, when I was vice chair, Harold Brown, the Secretary of Defense, said, what I'd like you to do is give me an annotation of my New York Times. Tell me which story I should regard as true and which I should be skeptical of. And that validation function seems to me to be more important as we move forward. Well, let me close with my favorite, one of my favorite reminiscences. When I was chairing the NIC, every time I'd go to a White House meeting, get the car to go to the White House meeting, I'd make sure I went out the entrance that takes you over that marble floor with the CIA crest in it. I wanted to be reminded what business I was in. The NIC took bed and board from the CIA, so that was where we were housed. And I wanted to be reminded of what business I was in. But I also would giggle a little bit. In the wall, etched in the wall is the quote from John, ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. I thought both halves of that were suspect in that building. There may be ecclesiastical truth, but in intelligence, there's the best we can do, good enough for government work. We try and tell the truth, but we know we're not going to get it right always. And second, the intelligence truth seems to be more often likely to constrain policy people than to set them free. Too often it says to policy people, here are the 11 reasons why this great idea of yours is somewhere between stupid and impossible. So I always got a bit of a giggle when I walked out and saw that etched in the walls of the CIA headquarters. Well, let me stop there and see if there are questions or comments.
Greg, we actually have a lot of questions. We're going to try to fit as many of these in as possible. Let's actually start with a couple of serious questions. We also have some others which are perhaps lighthearted. So on the serious questions, there was a comment about correlation. You've made an early comment about correlation versus causation. Quite interesting to hear that as you've progressed in your career in intelligence, that perhaps you have a stronger belief in correlation versus causation. And the comment was really that, well, causation can always be debated, whereas correlation really is not so debatable. Can you offer a few more comments about that topic?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, we used to talk a lot about in analysis 20 years ago about linchpins, drivers. It was all causation oriented, it seems to me. And now I think what we ought to be looking for, there's still some causation, obviously, but one of the things I like about correlation is, imagine if we look at, we'll find a lot of spurious correlations, but we may also find interesting correlations that make people think, that is, this is not exactly the butterfly wing, but close to it, that we may find interesting correlations. There are at least places we ought to look more. I'm always on the lookout for tips as to where analysts might aim their attentions. And I think correlation can help us there.
Cool. So the framework of that you mentioned of Secretary Rumsfeld around known knowns, unknown knowns, known unknowns, unknown unknowns. Would you view as, there's obviously been quite, well-known failures in intelligence. Would you view many of those failures as being attributed to the unknown knowns category?
Well, let's see, not too many, I suppose. But certainly the 9/11 is a nice example that we'd forgotten that we knew about these Arabs taking flying lessons. Indeed, my Iran colleague, Brian Jenkins, had written in the late 90s or late 80s, early 90s, that not he, but that the government was very worried about planes being used as bombs. So that was on our radar. It just wasn't on our radar in the time immediately before 9/11. So I think there are many of those, not many, but a significant number of cases like that. And there, I think AI can be a great help in making sure we don't forget the things we knew and that they become relevant when new events happen.
Interesting, right? So I guess many of failures. I don't want to harp on this, but perhaps more in the category of known unknowns or unknown unknowns. Is that we should think about that matrix?
I think, yeah, but certainly the unknown unknowns are, what Nassim Taleb calls black swans, and those are hard to think about. We used to joke at the NIC, well, we're interested, we understand we can't, by definition, know about the black swans, but maybe the Appaloosa swans we can think about.
So we have a great question from one of our favorite fans of the town hall, and also has spoken at our town hall. How do you view the role of intelligence in supporting DoD's decision superiority and cost imposition strategic thrusts?
Wow.
That's a complex question.
When I was vice chair of the NIC, we hired a wonderful Army two-star to be the National Intelligence Officer for Conventional Forces. We wanted to have somebody who was not an intelligence officer, but an operations officer. And he was terrific, had a long career as a national intelligence officer. He observed in one of our first lunches, he said, here we are doing an awful lot of thinking about the future here. And then in the Pentagon, they're doing all this planning about weapons and tactics and all that. Shouldn't there be more connection? And I think he was right. I think he's still right that in some sense, the Army does a lot, the military does a lot of its own intelligence, but that there ought to be stronger links, it seems to me, both in thinking about weaponry, but also thinking about strategy. I'd like to have more joint work thinking about, is a particular strategy working? When I was chair, before I got there, we'd done a national intelligence estimate on Afghanistan, and it turned out to be really extraordinarily useful because it became a kind of index for thinking about how well we were doing in Afghanistan. Not something that everybody necessarily liked, but I thought it was very useful.
Thank you, Greg. A question from the audience member, if you could perhaps also expand on this. Can you define NIC and NIC, and also just talk a little bit about the role of the NIC?
Oh, yeah, sure. Happy to. I hope people don't have dinner plans, right? I could talk for a long time. The NIC is the National Intelligence Council. It is and has been in various guises for basically 60 years, the for the last 40 at least, the main interagency body doing intelligence analysis. So basically, the NIC is organized like a little State Department, regionally and functionally, with national intelligence officers. Many of them come from the outside, inside and outside. Each of them has several deputy national intelligence officers. They're all seconded from different intelligence agencies. When I was chairing, we had a terrific cyber analyst from the Secret Service. I didn't even know the Secret Service did cyber. And we also had a terrific young analyst from NYPD. So it's a great group of people. Traditionally, the NIC did more strategic analysis, national intelligence estimates. That changed with the creation of the Director of National Intelligence, where now the NIC, not the CIA, provides the immediate intelligence support to the policy committees in Washington, the Principals Committee and the Deputies Committee. And that meant that basically my last year, we did something like 700 papers. Of those, 400 were basically responses to questions from the Deputies Committee or the Principals Committee. The challenge was that meant we were not doing much strategic analysis. We would try and smuggle things in. We'd say, okay, we're going to answer this rather tactical question, but maybe you'd like a little more background as to where these individuals or leaders are coming from. So we tried to do that, but it was always it was something I worried about all day, every day. Are we being strategic enough?
So most of the work on the NIC is obviously highly classified and sensitive, though I do know that I think periodically the NIC produces this global trends report, and you were responsible for one of them during your tenure, which is open to anybody to read.
Yeah, no, they've become quite a brand. I didn't get to do one when I was vice chair, but I did have some role in picking up the idea. And I was enough of a Washingtonian to know that if we'd given our policy counterparts a long document about the future, looking out 5 years to 20 years, they would have said, thank you very much. This is terrific. I'll really look forward to it. Never would have been opened, never would have been looked at. So I realized that since it was unclassified, then we could use the press. And knowing that if the press picked it up, then policy people would turn to their special assistant and say, what the devil is a NIC up to? And that's worked very well. To drive it home, when I released mine at the end of 2016, I did it at a day-long series of events at the museum in Washington, now sadly closed, but I wanted to make sure we got as much press as we possibly could.
It's great. It's great. As an audience member who's asking for your personal opinion, who do you worry most about, China or Russia? It's an A/B question.
Well, in the long run, I think China's a more important both partner and competitor. In the short run, obviously, one has to worry about what Putin might do, and what, as we see, I mean, Russia is essentially, from my perspective, a failing state. And failing states can be pretty dangerous, I think. We worry a lot about that in Ukraine, that Putin might do something reckless if he feels like he's going down, might want to take lots of the rest of us with him. So in the short run, I worry about that a lot. In the longer run, it seems to me Russia is essentially a failing state, and that raises all sorts of big questions about what Europe looks like as we look ahead. But more generally, China is obviously the more important power, both as a potential partner and as a competitor.
Yeah. We'll finish up the questions with one last question, because there's so many questions we can't get to all of them. Can you speak a little bit to kind of maybe historically and also looking forward, the role of women in intelligence?
Yeah, one of the big changes from over my tenure in intelligence, from the Church Committee in the 1970s on to being the chair in the 2010s, has been the change. National security in general, when I first started, was almost all men. Women were few and easily distinguished, obviously. That's changed dramatically. And so intelligence is now, I think, probably more than half of the deputy NIOs, national intelligence officers that worked for me, were women, lots of different agencies. Intelligence has not done so well in diversity, ethnically and otherwise. It's worked hard at it. And he even has a program in colleges. My USC program is sponsored by Director of National Intelligence with the ultimate goal of trying to attract more underrepresented groups into intelligence. But on the women front, it's done well. We see the number of leaders, Sue Gordon, impressive leaders of the agencies more and more. So that's been a welcome change, not just in intelligence, but in national security more generally.
I'm very pleased to hear about that, particularly since the APNP Women's Summit's going on right now. So thank you so much, Greg. I know our town hall producer is very keen to have you do a session of Vladimir Putin for our audience. Are you up for that?
Absolutely. Happy to do it.